What's the scariest real-life story you've heard or told? Story 1. There have been several confirmed cases in different countries of people secretly living inside other people's houses without their knowledge. I believe one of those cases went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner left for work and then sneak out to steal small amounts of food so as not to be noticed. Eventually, the homeowner did notice and could not figure out where his food was disappearing, so he set up a hidden camera to record everything. I can only imagine how terrifying it must have been to come home from work one night, sit down to watch the footage, and after hours of stillness, suddenly see someone crawling out of the attic. Then came the slow realization that the person was still in the house at that very moment, followed by the haunting thought of all those nights when strange noises had been dismissed as pipes, or the old wooden beams creaking, but were actually a living person just above. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. Story 2, I met a guy who had been traveling across Australia with a couple of friends, hitchhiking like many of us used to do. One of his friends mentioned that they were near his distant uncle's house, someone he had never met before. He got the uncle's phone number from a relative, and as they had hoped, the uncle invited them to stay for a while. He picked them up in town and drove them deep into his rural property, far out in the bush. He seemed like a normal, friendly, cheerful man. When it came time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle led them to a closet full of sleeping bags and bedrolls. They did not think much of it and each grabbed a set, setting up on the living room floor. They stayed for a couple of days. Nothing strange happened, and afterward, the uncle drove them to the bus station so they could continue their trip. About a year later, that same man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He had been picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and killing them. The guy who told me the story was 100% certain that he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of the victims. Story 3. A co-worker's father was babysitting his baby grandson one day. At some point, the grandfather went into the nursery to check on the baby and found that the child had somehow reached for the window blind cord and tangled himself in it to the point of choking. The baby was already blue, with veins bulging across his face. In a panic, the grandfather dialed 911. Emergency services arrived in about 2 to 3 minutes and managed to bring the little boy back to life. He made a full recovery. For parents reading this, please check how close any hanging cords are to your child's crib. When the baby was brought to the hospital, the parents and the grandfather were separated and questioned repeatedly as if they might have done it intentionally, but eventually it was proven to be a tragic accident. The child is now in his 20s and living a healthy, normal life. Story 4. I am a crime writer and once interviewed a woman who shared a terrifying story from her childhood. When she was around 10 years old, she struggled to sleep because she believed the boogeyman lived in her closet, staring at her through the night. Every night she would run downstairs to tell her parents, and every night her father would assure her that the boogeyman was not real and send her back to bed. After several nights of this, her father grew frustrated. That evening, he walked her back to her room, turned on the light, and said he would prove there was no boogeyman. But when he went to open the closet door, something from the other side held it shut. He quickly sent his daughter out of the room and forced the door open only to find a man hiding inside. The man had been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her. The father attacked and overpowered him, and the intruder was sent to prison. Years later, when I interviewed that woman, I looked up the man's record online. He had recently been released on parole and had stopped showing up for his mandatory check-ins. There was an active warrant for his arrest, and no one knew where he was. Story 5. Something similar happened to me when I was about 2 or 3 years old. My mom and I lived in a small, cheap, single-wide trailer in a very poor trailer park. She was a single mother working 2 jobs and attending cosmetology school after my dad left. Because she worked night shifts, I often stayed overnight at my aunt's house. One morning around 7 o'clock, she picked me up from my aunt's place, and we went back home. I remember immediately not wanting to go inside and begging to ride my bike, but my exhausted mom just wanted to sleep. So we went in, and she lay down in bed. I sat up watching Barney for a while, and being the annoying toddler I was, kept waking her up asking to go outside and ride my bike. We usually kept my bike in my room since leaving it outside meant it would get stolen. I told my mom I didn't want to go into my room and instead wanted to stay with her. While lying beside her, I suddenly told her there was someone in my closet who wanted to hurt me. I have no idea how I knew that. I don't even think I'd gone into my room that day. She got up to prove no one was there. But when she walked in, the folding closet door started to open and got stuck on something. It turned out that a previously convicted child molester who had skipped bail on a new trial had been watching my mom's routine for days. He broke into our trailer while she was at work and hid in my closet, taking my bike with him to lure me inside when we got home. The only thing that stopped him from jumping out to attack my mom was the spokes of my bike getting caught on the metal tabs at the bottom of the folding doors. We ran out of the house, jumped in the car, and drove away. Unfortunately, the man escaped before the police arrived. Even now, 26 years later, closets still make me uneasy. Story 6. My mom was stalked by a man in her chemistry class back in the late 1970s during her first semester of college. They were lab partners, and she thought he was cute and seemed nice. She was too shy at the time to ask him out, but said that if he had asked her, she would have said yes. They were friendly in class, but their paths rarely crossed outside it since they were in different majors. As the semester went on, though, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside her other classes, the library, the student union, and even at the spot where her father picked her up. This continued into the spring semester. Confused but not yet alarmed, she asked how he always knew where she was. He proudly replied, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom complained to the secretary who had given him the information, but the woman brushed it off, saying, "You two are dating." Thankfully, my mom had already arranged to transfer to another school for her sophomore year, and she spent the rest of that semester avoiding him. She never saw him again, or so she thought. Years later, when she was in graduate school, my grandmother got a knock on the door. A man in a naval uniform stood outside, and since my grandmother had been a Navy nurse, she let him in. He looked somber and began by saying how sorry he was for my mother's loss, which completely confused her. He explained, "Well, ma'am, I just got back from overseas and found out my friend recently took his own life. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him that her daughter did not even have a boyfriend, let alone a fiancé. It quickly became clear that the deceased friend was actually my mom's old stalker. The naval officer was visibly upset, and my grandmother, even more disturbed, made him leave before my mom came home. The strangest part about the stalker's death was that it had been ruled a suicide, even though he was found hanging from a high tree branch that required a ladder to reach with his hands tied behind his back. From what my mom later learned, he had a habit of snooping and meddling in things that didn't concern him, which had earned him plenty of enemies. She always ends the story casually, saying, "Back then, people didn't really understand stalking. They're a little better about it now. It still creeps me out to think what could have happened if he had followed her after she left that school." Story 7. A few years ago, I was living in a large city where I didn't know anyone. A guy I was seeing came from abroad to visit me. When his trip ended, I accompanied him to the train station. After he left, I went back into the metro to return home. It was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, bright and sunny outside. I sat down on a bench near a man. We made eye contact, and I said hello. He said hello back. Something about him felt off, but I tried to ignore it. When the metro arrived, we both got on. It was crowded. I found a seat, and he took one of the only available ones directly across from me. I started to think I was overreacting since he began talking to another man nearby as if they knew each other. The man got off after a few stops, but the stranger stayed. When my stop came up, I stood to change lines. He got up too and stood right behind me. I could see his reflection in the window, slowly looking me up and down. Uneasy, I walked faster as the doors opened. He followed. I changed direction toward another exit, and he changed course as well. I did this several times, each time confirming he was following me. My heart was pounding. I headed toward the passageway that led to the next metro line, but it was crowded with people. He caught up, pressing closer until I was backed against a wall, his face only inches from mine, smiling brightly. "Hello, how are you?" he asked, still moving closer. Terrified, I realized no one around would intervene. I glanced to my right and saw a staircase leading down. Without warning, I sprinted away. He was caught off guard and took a few seconds to react. I ran down the stairs and into a metro car, turning just in time to see him racing after me. Thankfully, the doors closed before he reached the bottom, and the train pulled away. Somehow I had jumped onto the correct line going home. Not that it mattered at the time. That experience, along with several other times men have followed me, has made me constantly anxious whenever I walk alone. Story 8. I don't know if this will sound scary to everyone, but when I was about 16, I went to a laundromat with a friend in her neighborhood. I didn't know the area well. I was just there to hang out. As we walked inside, there was an older man standing outside his car, looking for something. My friend walked right past him without even glancing his way, but I looked for a second and he noticed. He asked, "Will you come help me find my phone? I dropped it down here somewhere and can't find it." Immediately, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. When I looked into his car, I saw another man sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight at me with a cold, focused expression. The way he looked at me still haunts me. I quickly turned away and followed my friend inside. Once we were safely inside, my friend told me that those men were known human traffickers and that asking young girls for help was one of their tricks. I was shaken to my core. If I had been a little younger or less aware, I might have stepped closer to help him, and I might never have walked away from that parking lot. Story 9. It happened about 12 years ago. I am a 39-year-old anesthetist from Egypt. At that time, I was working in a small hospital in the rural city of Rosetta, the same place where the Rosetta Stone was discovered. The hospital had 5 floors. The dormitories were on the 5th, the ground floor held the emergency department, and the other floors contained the wards, laboratories, and the operating theater. The building was under maintenance at the time. One afternoon, I was on duty, but there were no surgeries scheduled, so I was in my 5th floor room browsing the internet on my small laptop. Then came a knock on the door. It was the janitor telling me that new furniture, beds, and wardrobes was being delivered and asking me to stay out of my room until they finished replacing the old pieces. I waited in the TV room for a while when suddenly the hospital's announcement system called my name, instructing me to report to the emergency department immediately. Before I could move, a security guard came running, saying there had been a major bus accident involving school children and that everyone was needed downstairs. I ran to my room, saw the new furniture already set up, closed the door, and rushed down. When I entered the emergency department, I immediately noticed the color of the walls. They had always been green, but now they were blue with silver decorations. While treating patients, I asked a nurse when the walls had been repainted. She looked at me strangely and said, "They've always been that color." There were many injured children and several doctors I didn't recognize, though I had worked at that hospital for years and knew nearly everyone. I asked colleagues about the new staff, and they all responded with confusion, insisting these people had been working there for years. I brushed it off and kept working. Thankfully, none of the children were critically injured. After a couple of hours, things calmed down. I stepped outside for fresh air and froze. The hospital was supposed to overlook the Nile River, but in front of me was the Mediterranean Sea. Rosetta is near the coast, but not that close. I could not believe what I was seeing. The surrounding buildings looked unfamiliar. Panic set in. I ran back inside, asking everyone where we were, but they looked at me like I was insane. I tried to call my parents, but no one answered. Then I searched for the number of my mentor, an older anesthetist I considered family. His name wasn't in my phone, and no one at the hospital had heard of him. I knew I wasn't dreaming. My mind was clear. I had been calculating drug doses and managing patients. I decided to leave the hospital immediately and find my family. I ran back to my room to grab my things, and when I opened the door, everything was back to normal. My old furniture, no new bed, no new wardrobe. I stood there, frozen. Then a security guard appeared, telling me there had been a major bus accident involving children and that the public announcement system was down due to maintenance, so they were calling doctors individually. He asked if any other doctors were in the dormitory, and I said I didn't know. I looked out the window. The Nile was back, exactly as before. But I was shaken to my core. I went down again, saw the same injured children, and even recognized the exact wounds from before. My colleagues were the same ones I always worked with. No unfamiliar faces. They asked if I was okay since I looked pale and unsteady. The following days were hell. I couldn't think clearly, and nightmares plagued my sleep. I took a week off to recover. I wasn't on any medication or under stress, and I am certain it wasn't a dream. I can still recall the details of every child, every injury, and every action I took. I have only told this story to that older anesthetist and later to my wife because even now, whenever I think about it, the same indescribable fear washes over me. Story 10. I used to work in law enforcement, and this story will stay with me for the rest of my life. We were called to a caravan park after a woman had been heard screaming inside one of the caravans all day, though the call only came in that evening. My partner and I arrived at the address, and a large, friendly man answered the door. He was so tall he completely blocked the entrance, making it impossible for me to see inside. I told him we'd received complaints about a woman screaming from this address. He smiled and calmly said that he and his partner had been arguing earlier about something being stolen from outside the caravan, which he claimed was her fault, a clear lie. He seemed polite and easy to deal with, but I wasn't about to leave without checking on the woman. We're required to ensure everyone's safety before clearing a call. He hesitated but eventually stepped aside. Inside, I saw a woman sitting on the bed, completely covered in layers of clothing and wearing large sunglasses, even though it was nighttime. That was strange, but I thought maybe drugs were involved. I asked if she was okay, and she only nodded. She refused to remove her glasses, and legally I couldn't force her. I gave them both a verbal warning about the noise and told them to keep it down. Still, something didn't sit right with me. I didn't have enough evidence for an arrest, so I went next door to ask if anyone had seen or heard anything. The neighbors immediately told me the woman was covered in bruises and begged me to get her out of there. They agreed to provide statements, which gave me enough evidence to act. I returned to the caravan, arrested the man, and secured him in the back of the patrol car. When I went back inside, the woman tried to stand but collapsed instantly. We helped her back onto the bed, and as she began removing her layers of clothing and sunglasses, the horror of what had been happening became clear. She was covered in bruises, her face swollen and disfigured, both eyes blackened. Her legs and stomach had fresh blowtorch burns. There were deep, infected puncture wounds all over her body from a screwdriver. She had been tied up in that tiny, filthy caravan for weeks, tortured every minute she was awake. The worst part was how normal, how friendly that man had seemed when he answered the door. You truly never know what kind of evil hides behind a smile. We got him sentenced to life in prison without bail. She received medical care and was placed in a recovery home for domestic violence survivors. She began to heal and was doing well, but the most heartbreaking part was when she softly asked if she would ever be allowed to see him again, still in love with the man who had destroyed her. Story 11. A van carrying 6 passengers and a driver was on its way to an engagement celebration, traveling along a lonely road. The driver grew drowsy and began to drift off. When he snapped awake, the van was already out of control. In a desperate split-second decision, he jumped out through his door to save himself. The van careened off the road, tumbling violently. 4 passengers died instantly. 1 person miraculously survived with only minor fractures. Another, a woman, barely clung to life. Her skull was cracked, the bone beneath her eyes shattered and caved in. Glass from the windows lodged in her eyes, her nasal bone broken, her jaw crushed and teeth knocked out. Her shoulder was dislocated, her hip fractured, her toes broken, and a large section of skin was torn from her feet. She was rushed to the hospital and underwent multiple surgeries. She later said the only thing that kept her alive was the thought of her children growing up without their mother. When I saw her after surgery, she was wrapped completely in bandages like the Invisible Man, with only small openings for her eyes and a hole where her lips were. She couldn't speak for months and didn't walk for a year. That woman was my mother, and the year was 2006. I was 9 or 10 years old then, and the image of her wrapped in bandages, silent and broken, still haunts my dreams. Story 12. This happened to my sister-in-law when she was around 11 or 12 years old. She and her family lived in a trailer park, and just down the street was her bus stop for school. Every morning, she noticed a man inside his trailer taking pictures of her and her friends. It creeped her out so much that she went home and told her mom, my mother-in-law, what was happening. She explained how the man would stand in his window, staring and snapping photos of them. Her mom immediately called the police and reported him, but they did nothing. This continued for about 2 more weeks with no response from law enforcement, and my sister-in-law became so terrified that she refused to wait for the bus alone. Her mom called the police again, demanding action. This time, they finally went to the man's trailer, and what they found was horrifying. Inside, one wall was completely covered with pictures of my sister-in-law, other young girls from the neighborhood, and several disturbing images of child exploitation. Everyone in the area stood outside watching as the man was handcuffed and taken away by the police. Story 13. My dad has several true stories that still disturb me. Some sound unbelievable, but I promise they're real. I'll summarize them to keep it short. One of my uncles is mentally disabled. When he was a child in the 1970s, he went missing. Everyone in the neighborhood searched for him, checking all his favorite spots, parks, friends' houses, the schoolyard, but there was no trace. My dad, who was one of 8 siblings, was searching with another brother when they finally found him. He was sitting alone at his favorite park, the same one they had already checked twice, rocking back and forth on one of those spring-mounted playground horses as dusk settled in. No one ever figured out where he had been during those missing hours. When my dad was around 10, he used to read aloud to a blind neighbor who lived with her adult son. She was in her 90s and adored his visits. One day, she fell and broke her hip, so he couldn't visit her for a while. When he finally went to see her again, he found her frail, sitting in a soiled diaper, covered in bruises. Her son had been abusing her. Not long after, an ambulance arrived at her house. She had survived an assault in which her son had grabbed her forearm so violently that he degloved it. She lived a little longer, and my dad got to see her one final time, her arm bandaged before she passed away. In another story, when my dad was a teenager, a neighbor offered him and his brother money to rough up some local kids who had been damaging his lawn. They agreed, thinking it was harmless, and went after 2 brothers. They didn't seriously injure them, but my dad deeply regrets it. As they were finishing, they heard sirens and ran to hide in the bushes. An ambulance, police car, and fire truck arrived at the boys' house. They watched as paramedics carried out a body under a white sheet. The boy's mother had died suddenly of heart failure on the toilet. My dad still says that was the worst day of his life, realizing the cruelty of what he'd done and how meaningless it was compared to the real pain others were enduring. It's not a ghost story, but it's haunting in its own way. A reminder that doing the wrong thing can scar you forever, and that kindness costs nothing. Story 14. I once heard a story from a girl about her former roommate that still gives me chills. After moving to a new city for a job, the roommate bought her own house and started living alone. She soon met a man, and they began dating. Everything seemed completely normal. He was charming, polite, and they got along well. After a few dates, she invited him back to her house, and they started sleeping together. This went on several times without issue, until one afternoon when she came home from work and heard strange noises coming from the basement, a place she rarely visited. Alarmed, she immediately left the house and called the police. When they arrived and went downstairs, they discovered an entire room covered in plastic sheets. Inside were tools typically used for cleaning large game animals or dissecting human bodies. It turned out the man had been planning to kill her, dissect her, and eat her. When they arrested him, investigators found similar tools at his home, along with human flesh stored in his deep freezer. He had murdered and cannibalized multiple victims before her. He was later convicted and sent to prison, but she has struggled with severe psychological trauma ever since. The thought that she had unknowingly dated a cannibal still haunts her and everyone who knows the story. Story 15. This happened to me when I was living in Karachi, Pakistan, before I moved to the United Kingdom. My family lived very close to a building that belonged to the Criminal Investigation Department, basically the Pakistani equivalent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But none of us knew that at the time. We always assumed it was just a regular government office. On November 11th, 2010, around evening, I was heading home from work and decided to stop by the gym about half a mile away because it had a sauna. I changed clothes and started walking there, just a 10-minute walk. I was only about a tenth of a mile away when for a split second I felt the ground tremble, and then came the loudest explosion I have ever heard, followed by a violent shock wave that slammed into my chest. The blast was so powerful that both my ears started bleeding instantly. It felt like being kicked in the chest by a giant in steel boots. I hit the ground, covering my ears as they throbbed with pain, surrounded by dust and debris. Car alarms were going off everywhere. Glass was shattered across a 1 to 2 mile radius, and I could smell smoke, gunpowder, and burning flesh. A smell that still makes me sick when I think of it. As rocks and debris rained down, I realized some of it wasn't just dirt. It was human skin and flesh. I looked down and saw a piece stuck to my arm. I wiped it off in horror, shaking. I started walking toward the noise, seeing people screaming and cars on fire. Buildings had cracks several feet wide, and through a gap in a wall, I saw what looked like a scene from a war zone. People crying, bleeding, bodies everywhere. A crater about 30 feet wide had formed where the Criminal Investigation Department building once stood. It was completely gone. Hundreds of people were dead or dying, some missing legs, others with their intestines spilled out. Some burned beyond recognition. I saw a woman hitting herself and crying over her husband's mangled body. The worst image burned into my memory was a young man, maybe 18 or 20, lying face down with his head turned toward me, eyes wide open as if staring directly into mine. His feet were twisted backward. That sight never left me. When I finally made it home, I thought the nightmare was over, but for weeks afterward, I would wake up screaming, seeing that same young man standing in my hallway at night, silently staring at me. Even now, years later, I can still see his eyes and feel the echo of that explosion in my chest. Story 16. My mom's best friend was driving home from work late one night when she saw flashing lights behind her and got pulled over by what appeared to be a police officer. She had no idea why, but assumed it might be a broken taillight, so she calmly pulled over. The officer approached her car and confirmed that her taillight was supposedly out, then asked for her license and registration. She handed them over, and he walked back to his patrol car for several minutes. When he returned, his questions started off normal. Where she was coming from, where she was headed, but quickly turned strange. He began asking if she had a husband at home, if she had children, if she owned any weapons, if she had daughters, and even if there were any aggressive pets in the house. Alarm bells went off immediately. She told him that his questions were inappropriate, but that only seemed to set him off. "I'm a Fing cop," he shouted. "Do you know what that means? It means you shut the F up and do what I say. Step out of the car." Terrified, she rolled up her window and frantically searched her purse for her phone. The man began pounding on her window and violently yanking at her door handle, screaming, "Get out of the Fing car, you bitch! You dirty slut, I said out!" In a panic, she slammed her foot on the gas and sped off. The man gave chase for a short distance before backing off as she reached a main road. Once she was safe, she called 911, only to learn that there were no officers conducting traffic stops in that area. In the following days, police discovered that a serial rapist had been impersonating an officer and targeting women in the region. She never even had a broken taillight. The man had her full name, address, and personal information, and knew she was unarmed. She immediately purchased a pistol for protection and lived in fear until the imposter was finally caught. Story 17, I was too young to remember this, but it's a story my parents and my babysitter told me countless times. They waited until I was about 11 to tell me, and I cried all night afterward. When I was a baby, my mom and dad lived in an old pre-war apartment in New York City. It had all the quirks of an aging building, creaking floors, drafty windows, but some things couldn't be explained so easily. My mom said she would open a window, and later it would be mysteriously closed again. At first, she assumed it was just loose framing or gravity, but the pattern continued for weeks. She eventually propped the window open with a stick, determined to stop it from shutting. Minutes later, she heard shattering glass from the other room. When she ran back, the window had completely exploded. Glass scattered both inside and outside the apartment. There was no logical explanation. After that, things escalated. The disturbances seemed to focus on me. The nursery window wouldn't stay open. The door to my room would slowly swing wide on its own. My dad swore he'd seen my mom walk into the nursery, only to find she wasn't anywhere near it. One night, my parents went to the movies and left my aunt to babysit. She had heard their stories, but didn't believe them until that night. Everything was normal at first. She put me to bed and settled on the couch, but soon she noticed movement in the hallway and saw a shadow by my door. Grabbing whatever she could find as a weapon, she crept forward, thinking an intruder had broken in. When she opened the door, the room was empty. She picked me up, too afraid to put me down again. A while later, she heard the front door unlock and the familiar sound of my parents talking and laughing in the kitchen. Relieved, she walked out to greet them, only to find the kitchen empty. My parents didn't return home for another hour, but my aunt swore she had heard their exact voices. She never agreed to babysit me again. Story 18. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I didn't have any real friends because my family life was a mess, and I had severe attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and crooked teeth that made me insecure. But there was an older girl named Angela who lived next door. She was around 14 or 15. I didn't know any better, and when she asked me to hang out all the time, I agreed. One day she invited me inside to play, and she led me into her parents' bedroom. Her father was some kind of military man, an Army Ranger or Special Forces type, and the room was filled with weapons. Angela picked up a shotgun and started joking about killing me and other people. I was 6, so I thought it was just make-believe and laughed. Then she loaded the gun right in front of me and showed me how it worked before pointing it directly at my face. She ordered me to crawl around her house for hours, pressing the gun into my mouth or against my head whenever I slowed down or cried. She even dry-fired other guns to scare me. At one point, she told me to take my clothes off. I said I'd do it in the bathroom because I felt uncomfortable undressing in front of her. When I got inside, I slammed the door, locked it, and jumped out the window, which was about a story and a half up. I landed on my face and chipped a tooth, but somehow got away. I kept that secret for about 2 weeks before finally telling my mom. When she found out, she lost her mind and called the police. They went to Angela's house and questioned her and her parents. Angela claimed she did it because I had shot her with a Nerf gun once. So this was her payback. I didn't see her again for years until I heard she had been committed to a mental hospital by her parents. I still don't like to think about what could have happened if I hadn't jumped. Story 19. A few years back, I read a story that has never left my mind. It was set in Ireland sometime during the 1990s and told by a woman who had survived an assault in her own home. The man who attacked her had been posing as an employee from the local gas company. She described how she had been at home when she heard a knock on the door. Looking through the window, she saw a man in uniform holding a clipboard, smiling and waving. He gestured to indicate he was there to read the gas meter, something that was normal for older houses. She started to walk toward the door, but suddenly a wave of overwhelming fear washed over her. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. She paused, trembling, arguing with herself that she was being paranoid. Through the closed door, she called out that she was busy and asked him to come back later. He insisted it would only take 2 minutes, saying they had already been around earlier in the week. Against every warning signal in her body, she reached for the lock, even as tears welled in her eyes and her mind screamed, "Don't open it!" The moment she opened the door, he forced his way in and assaulted her. She later wrote a book discussing the power of instinct, how the mind can sense danger long before logic catches up. The terrifying part wasn't just the attack itself, but how clearly her inner voice had warned her, and she ignored it. It's haunting to realize that we all have that primal awareness inside us, a remnant of something ancient, something meant to protect us from predators, that waits quietly until the moment we need it most. Story 20. My friend's mother, a former member of the Christchurch, New Zealand chapter of the mongrel mob, once told me about one of the most horrifying things she ever witnessed. One of her friends, drunk and high on drugs, got into a violent argument with his wife that turned into a brutal beating. During the assault, he struck her so hard that she fell backward through their glass sliding door. As she fell, not all the glass shattered. Some jagged shards at the bottom stayed intact, slicing deep into her abdomen. Too intoxicated to notice or think clearly, he dragged her back into the living room, tearing open the wound even more until her insides were exposed. She died only minutes later in full view of their children, who were sitting frozen on the couch, too young and terrified to move. The husband, known in their gang as Green Eyes, didn't even seem to comprehend what he had done until the drugs wore off. A few days after his arrest, he hanged himself in his jail cell. Every time I think about that story, all I can picture are those children trapped in that nightmare, watching everything unfold. Story 21. This isn't my story, but it's one I read a long time ago and never forgot. It's about a couple who started dating when they were teenagers. For one of their first dates, they decided to take a late-night walk on a mountain trail. It was close to midnight, and although the moon was out, a stretch of the trail formed a tunnel of trees where it was completely dark. The girl was nervous but agreed to go because the boy said he knew the area well. As they entered the dark section, he suddenly felt something heavy and soft brush against his leg in the middle of the path. Without a word, they both turned and ran back to the car. They didn't stop to check what it was. They just had an instinctive, gut-level feeling to get out of there. Years later, after they were married and had a child, they were watching a television interview with the recently captured Ted Bundy. When asked when he thought he'd come closest to being caught, Bundy said there had been one night on a mountain trail around midnight when he had just murdered a woman and hidden in the bushes. He said a young couple had walked straight onto the path where he left the body close enough to touch it, then turned around and left without even looking down. Story 22. 6 years ago, when I was 12, I almost became the victim of a murder and rape attempt. Back then, I was 5 feet 8 inches tall and barely 90 pounds and just a skinny kid home alone for a few days while my mom was away. My older brother was supposed to be home that evening, but had stepped out. I was in the bathroom getting ready to shower, sitting on the toilet and scrolling through my phone while the water ran. The bathroom was at the back of the house, right next to a closet and near the back door. Suddenly, I heard the closet door creak open, followed by slow footsteps. Someone had been hiding inside. My heart dropped. I quietly texted my brother, told him someone was in the house, and asked him to call 911. I didn't move, afraid that any sound would give me away. I could hear the intruder pacing in the kitchen just a few feet away. My mind raced. How could I escape? What could I use as a weapon? Would I die tonight? Tears streamed down my face, but I stayed silent. After what felt like forever, police sirens echoed outside, and I heard shouting. They stormed in and caught the man off guard. The horror didn't end there. When they identified him, I learned it was my neighbor from 4 houses down, a man who had already been convicted of multiple sexual assaults on both adults and children. He had been armed with a knife. The most chilling part came when the officers knocked on the bathroom door, calling my name and telling me it was safe. I reached for the doorknob and realized with absolute terror that I had never locked it. For years after that night, I had nightmares and post-traumatic stress. Therapy helped, and I've since built myself up, learned self-defense, trained my body, but I still can't stay home alone. Story 23, I grew up in a close-knit neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. We'd watch each other's houses, feed pets, and lend a hand whenever someone went on vacation. Years later, after I'd grown up, a new neighbor moved in behind my property near my horse area. I introduced myself to the lady who owned the house, and she mentioned that her grandson would be moving in soon with their horses. I gave her my number, offering to help if she ever needed anything. Then her grandson arrived, and he was immediately strange. He started by jumping my fence and trying to ride my horse without permission. Soon, he set up a chair by his side of the fence so he could watch me whenever I went to work or fed my horse. One day, he sent me more than 50 text messages while I was asleep, accusing me of moving my fence 3 feet onto his property and rambling nonsense. When I looked outside, he was pacing the fence line, clearly waiting for me. I called my brother-in-law to come over so I wouldn't have to confront him alone. When we did, the guy threatened to burn us alive. We called the police, but they said they couldn't do anything. That night, while I was at work, he sent more terrifying messages, telling me I had messed up. When I got home, my fence had been cut down in 3 spots, and he'd put caution tape across his section. Again, the police came but said their hands were tied because everything was considered a misdemeanor. I eventually got a restraining order, but it didn't help. He started harassing my elderly and female neighbors next, claiming he owned the easement between our homes. One day, his grandmother parked diagonally, blocking the neighbor's driveway, and they had her car towed. That evening, I came home after dark and saw taillights near my driveway. Nobody parks on our private road, so my gut told me something was wrong. As I drove past, I saw it was him sitting in his truck, waiting. Fear took over. I tried to make a quick U-turn, but before I could finish, he floored it and slammed into the side of my car T-bone. Me then kept pushing, ramming my little car up the road before speeding home. I was shaking as I called 911 and texted my sister and brother-in-law. They arrived within minutes, but the police took 45. While we waited, he came back on foot, ranting about how much he wanted to feel his knife popping through my skin and feel my warm blood between his fingers. Then he rushed me, grabbed me by the shoulders, lifted me, and smashed my head into my car repeatedly until I lost consciousness. My brother-in-law drew his gun, and the man dropped me and ran back to his house. When the police finally arrived, they arrested him. The most terrifying realization was that he'd already cut down the gate near my horse area. If he'd been thinking clearly, he could have waited there where I'd be completely alone. I have no doubt I would have died that night if my family hadn't come. The worst part, he's already out of jail. The court-appointed district attorney did nothing, and his expensive lawyer got the attempted murder charge dropped. He served 1 year for felony hit and run, and now walks free on 4 years probation. Story 24. This story came from my mom, and it still gives me chills. Back in 1988, around the time the movie Paranormal Activity would later terrify audiences decades later, my mom had lunch with a close friend who was terrified because her husband was about to be released from prison. She had never filed for divorce during his sentence and didn't know what to do when he got out. 10 years earlier, they had moved into what seemed like a perfect home in a quiet cul-de-sac. But soon after moving in, strange things began happening. Their 2 young daughters shared a room and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming from night terrors, puddles of urine on the wooden floor so large it seemed impossible for such small children. The husband began acting distant, spending hours locked in his office and insisting on sleeping separately. One night, only a few months after moving in, the wife fell asleep on the couch. She woke to see her husband standing in the corner, whispering to someone or something that wasn't there. She could clearly hear him say, "I know I have to kill her." Then he turned toward her and attacked, stabbing her more than 40 times with a kitchen knife. Her screams woke the children, who ran for help. The neighbors, one of whom was a preacher, came running. The preacher burst in holding a Bible and shouted, "Drop the knife in God's name." At that exact moment, the husband dropped the weapon and collapsed unconscious. The wife survived after 2 months in the hospital, and the husband was sentenced to 10 years in prison. When she returned to collect her belongings before selling the house, a neighbor came over to apologize. They confessed they had felt guilty for not warning her. The previous owners had also reported strange, terrifying experiences in that same house, and had moved out after only a year. Story 25. My friend's dad, who's a pastor and one of the most genuinely honest people I've ever met, once told me this story that still makes my skin crawl. He was at the church one afternoon, helping plan the Christmas decorations, when an administrator came in saying that a woman had just walked into the front office asking for help. He went to greet her and immediately noticed that she was blindfolded. Before he could even speak, she threw herself into his arms, asking if he was a man of God. He said yes, that he followed God and Jesus, and served as the church's pastor. She dropped to her knees, thanking God for bringing her there, and explained that the devil was after her, that the only way she could stay safe was by not knowing where she was, because if she knew, the devil would find her. At first, he thought she was mentally unwell. He gently asked for her name, but she refused, saying that speaking it aloud might let the devil find her. When he asked where she'd come from, she said she didn't know, and begged to stay at the church for protection. He asked how she'd managed to get there if she couldn't see, and she replied that angels had guided her, step by step. He didn't believe her, until she offered to prove it. She let him outside, got into her car still wearing the blindfold, and drove perfectly, stopping at signs, making turns, even parallel parking, without removing it. Then she told him to look closely and slipped her hand under the blindfold. He swore that her hand disappeared beneath it, as if it had vanished entirely. Convinced something truly strange was happening, he decided to take her somewhere safe and called a police officer friend to follow behind them in case anything went wrong. The pastor drove ahead, the woman followed behind him, still blindfolded, and the cop followed her, lights on, escort style. They arrived at a hotel owned by a church member who offered her a room free of charge. She said she needed to shower, as she'd been on the road for 4 days. The men waited outside her room discussing what to do next. The officer checked her wallet for identification and found her driver's license. When he ran it, dispatch confirmed that she had been reported missing 8 days earlier. While the officer was on the phone, the pastor and the hotel owner suddenly heard her screaming from inside the room. He knows I'm here! He knows I'm here! They rushed to unlock the door, fumbling with the master key. By the time they got inside, the screaming had stopped. They broke open the bathroom door, and she was gone. The only thing left was her blindfold lying in the shower. There were no windows, no vents, no way out. Authorities investigated the pastor, the cop, and the hotel owner for weeks, but security footage confirmed they had done nothing wrong. The woman was never seen again. The pastor's wife later confirmed the story and said it was one of 3 terrifying experiences her husband had lived through, though he refuses to talk about the other 2. Story 26. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but I need to get it off my chest. A few years ago, a man tried to kill me at work, and it was all caught on these security cameras. I was closing the retail store alone that night. The front wall was made entirely of glass windows, and just before closing time, a man came in acting erratic, belittling me, saying bizarre things. Then he claimed he was both God and Justin Timberlake and accused me of killing Selena. He said he was bringing the rapture and that I had to die first. I laughed nervously, a reflex, I guess, and that's when he lunged at me. Everything after that is blurry. I remember running, shouting, and somehow managing to lock him outside. I called the police and hid in the back room, peeking out every so often to see him still out front, pounding on the glass, trying to get in. The dispatcher told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way. I waited for what felt like forever. No one came. I called again, terrified, and the operator snapped at me, saying I probably just didn't see the officers and needed to learn how to look. She told me they wouldn't enter the store since the man was outside and that I was safe to leave. She said I could wait 20 minutes if it made me feel better. So I waited. When I finally looked outside, he was gone. I closed up, locked the doors, and started walking to my car. That's when he jumped out from behind a pillar. My heart stopped. I was done running. I threw my bag to the ground and shouted that I'd fight him if I had to. Just then, a family walked out of a restaurant across the street. The man saw them, hesitated, and stepped back. It gave me just enough time to jump into my car and speed away. I was shaking uncontrollably the whole drive home. The next day when I filed a police report, the operator put me on hold, apparently because no officers had ever been dispatched to my call. Story 27. This happened earlier this year, though, honestly. With how chaotic 2020 has been, I can't even remember the month. I live in New Mexico, and it's usually easier for me to drive up to Denver for my medical green and to stop by IKEA. My wife booked us a cheap room at the Ramada in Centennial for one night. We checked in around 9 in the evening. The man at the front desk, whom I'll call Jack, seemed friendly enough. Our room had one of those adjoining doors connecting it to the next room, and we could clearly hear people moving around in there with their TV on. At one point, someone tried the doorknob to our side. I brushed it off, assuming it was kids. Later, my wife and I went out to the balcony for a couple of puffs. She almost never smokes, but it was a relaxed night. Afterward, we went down to grab snacks. On the way, we passed Jack again. This time, he looked tense, head down, walking fast and not acknowledging us at all. It gave me a bad feeling. Back in our room, my wife started dozing off around 10:30 while I stepped onto the balcony again. As I opened the sliding door, I heard the neighboring balcony door slide open too. When I went back in, I heard theirs close again. I turned on the TV, still high but alert. Suddenly, a woman's voice screamed from next door. My wife bolted upright and whispered, "Babe." So I knew she'd heard it too. We muted everything, and I pressed my ear to the connecting door. That's when I heard choking sounds, followed by a man shouting, "Shut the F up! Get the F up!" My blood went cold. I woke my wife and made her listen. We heard 2 loud thuds, then the neighbor's door slam. Footsteps hurried down the hall, but when I opened our door, no one was there. My wife told me not to call the cops, insisting I was just paranoid because I was high. I regret listening to her. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, there was total silence from the other room. When we went to check out, Jack was at the desk again, but this time he looked rough. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and he had a fresh gash on his forehead that definitely hadn't been there before. When I told him I was worried about noises from the next room, he went pale and started sweating. He stammered that he knew the guy staying there, that the man and his girlfriend had been having problems, and he hadn't realized it was that bad. He wouldn't look at me and just stared at his computer. As soon as we left, my wife admitted, "Okay, that was weird." I finally called the police, but since Centennial is outside Denver, I kept getting transferred. While still on the phone, a patrol car pulled into the lot. I hung up and told the officer everything. His response? That doesn't sound right. I'll look into it. That was it. I left with a pit in my stomach, convinced Jack from the front desk had something to do with whatever happened in that room. I still hate myself for not calling that night. I even left a detailed Google review just to leave some kind of trace in case that woman was never found. Story 28. When my mom was a teenager, she lived on Chicken Alley, supposedly one of the most haunted places in Wisconsin. One night, she and her sisters were playing in their shared bedroom, while my grandparents were out on a date. My aunt went downstairs to grab a glass of milk and sat at the bottom of the staircase to drink it. She felt someone brush past her, but when she turned, no one was there. Scared, she hurried back upstairs. They shut the bedroom door and tried to keep playing, but they could hear footsteps going up and down the stairs, slow, deliberate steps that stopped right outside their door before continuing again. It went on for hours. Then the banging started. Something slammed on the door over and over, louder each time. Terrified, they pushed their dresser against it and huddled together. Eventually, the noise stopped and the house fell silent. When my grandparents came home later that night, they had to yell for the girls to move the dresser so they could get in. 37 years later, my mom brought me, my brothers, and my cousins to a church where a priest told us our family seemed to attract the paranormal. Apparently, that explained why I've always seen things that aren't there. I've been tested and doctors say I don't have schizophrenia. Nobody has ever been able to explain what I see or why it feels like something has been following our family for generations. Story 29. My mom told me this story about my grandfather, and she swears it's true even though he refuses to talk about it to this day. My grandpa drove semi-trucks for Pepsi, hauling deliveries all over the state. He'd been driving since he was 21 and had never been in a wreck until the final year before his retirement at 64. One afternoon, while driving his usual route, a man suddenly backed out of his driveway straight into the road. My grandfather slammed the brakes and laid on the horn, but there was no time. The truck hit the man's car head-on, killing him instantly. My grandfather immediately called the police, sobbing hysterically. Later, he called my mom and her siblings, still crying and shouting that he'd killed someone. He was mentally shattered for months afterward. Even though the police determined it wasn't his fault, the victim's family filed a lawsuit. My grandfather had to hire an attorney, but the case fell apart quickly. The investigation showed the other driver had ignored medical advice not to drive while taking prescription medication that impaired his reflexes. The suit was dropped almost immediately, but the guilt never left my grandfather. He'd spent 43 years on the road without a single accident, and then in the last year before retirement, this happened. My mom says he still wakes up some nights shaking, whispering that he can still see the man's face. It's been decades, but that single moment broke something inside him forever. Story 30. In August of 1995, in the south side of Lafayette, Louisiana, a young woman was raped at 2 a.m. when an armed intruder broke into the house where she was babysitting. The attacker held a flashlight to her face, wore a mask, a knitted cap, and gloves. After the assault, he forced her to shower and urinate, erasing potential evidence. Days later, a friend of the victim realized she had been assaulted by a man with the same words and behavior 3 years earlier. When police connected their stories, they found multiple unsolved rape cases dating back to 1984. Each victim had been forced to shower, but investigators managed to collect 6 semen samples, all of which matched. The pattern revealed a serial rapist operating for over a decade. Detectives noted the attacker's commanding tone and the way he held his flashlight traits suggesting he had law enforcement training. He became known as the South Side Rapist. Eventually, investigators used new geographic profiling software and noticed that a sheriff's deputy, Ernest Randall Como, lived only 2 miles from every attack site. Como was assigned to the juvenile division, handling cases of child abuse. Then an anonymous tip named him directly. Investigators collected a cigarette butt he discarded during a smoke break and tested it. The DNA matched perfectly with the samples from all 6 crime scenes. When arrested, Comeau confessed to 12 rapes and 2 others police hadn't known about. Officer Terry Reagan, head of the Southside Rapist Task Force, was furious and heartbroken, saying, "We work these cases together. I was personal friends with Randy Comeau." Comeau was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison. It later came out that he had been investigated 3 times by Internal Affairs. His ex-girlfriend had accused him of assault and warned that he was a addict and solely perverted, unfit to work in the juvenile division. Each investigation was closed as inconclusive, and no action was taken. When his guilt was finally exposed, his fellow officers refused to defend him. Captain Jim Kraft said, "We were shocked and disappointed. Once he crossed that line, he was just another criminal to us." Story 31. The summer after the current president was elected, my mom and I went on a cruise. One of our scheduled destinations had closed its U.S. Embassy right before we left, so the cruise line rerouted us to a private island they owned. We were excited for a day of snorkeling, something we always did on tropical trips. Once we got to the beach, we reserved a pair of clamshell chairs, dropped our bags, and went to rent snorkel gear. But as soon as I got near the stand, an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. My mom asked me which color mask I wanted, and I told her, "Absolutely not. I'm not snorkeling today." She gave me a weird look, but then admitted she had a bad feeling too. We shrugged it off, got pina coladas instead, and waded into the calm, eerily still water. About 30 minutes later, someone screamed. A 50-year-old woman had been found floating face down, still wearing her snorkel gear. Her daughter had thought she was just admiring fish, but when rescuers turned her over, blood poured from her nose and mouth. My mom and I ran toward the scene, ready to perform CPR, but a staff member had already started. Every compression made a sickening crunch, blood bubbling down her chin and across her swimsuit as her daughter clung to her feet, begging her to breathe. We later learned that the daughter had taken her mother on the cruise as a healing trip after her father's death. Now she was alone. The staff never released an official cause of death, but passengers whispered that the snorkeling gear might have malfunctioned. I still get chills thinking about it. That day, for some reason, both my mom and I knew something wasn't right, and it might have saved our lives. Story 32. When I was in 6th grade about 5 years ago, I got the chance to serve as a page for a member of the Illinois Senate. A few friends joined me, and we were all thrilled. It sounded like the coolest experience ever. Our job was simple: fetch food, coffee, and whatever else the senators requested from the cafeteria. Before we even entered the chamber, a reporter warned us, "No matter how bad the Senate seems, the House of Representatives is worse." I thought it was a joke until we walked in. The place was a mess. Candy wrappers and Dorito bags littered the floor, and by the time coffee arrived, the mess had doubled. The session lasted about an hour and a half, but the most shocking part wasn't the trash. It was how many senators were absent or simply walking out while bills were being read. Other pages and I did our best to fulfill every request, but it quickly became clear that some senators used us as an excuse to leave mid-session. Our assigned senator even left for coffee, despite us offering multiple times to get it for him. While he was gone, the clerk called his bill to the floor, but because he wasn't there to present it, they skipped it entirely. Not a single bill passed that day. Ironically, one of the proposals discussed that day, raising the legal smoking age in Illinois, was later passed into law, setting the minimum age to 21. Our chaperone tried to take a photo of us on the Senate floor for proof of our participation, but security immediately made her delete it from her phone. Looking back, the whole experience felt surreal and disillusioning. For the first time, I understood why Illinois has such a reputation for corruption and inefficiency.